So, the title of my talk this morning is The Mask We Wear. And it's going to be about how we develop this thing we call the self, this me that we carry around, this thing that we think we are, this persona that we think we are, this thing we sometimes call ego, the part of us that allows us to spend so much time operating on autopilot. And I'm going to suggest this morning that the more we understand about this thing, the self, the more we can manage it well and skillfully. And as we manage it skillfully, we do so to reduce our suffering in the world and those around us. Because I'm going to suggest that a poorly managed sense of self will lead to suffering both for ourselves and others. So I'm going to delve into some of these questions this morning. So let's just sort of start at the beginning. Other than our genetic predispositions, however, whatever DNA we get from our parents, we come into the world pretty much as a blank slate. You know, we're a helpless organism with only basic functions of nutrition, hunger, nutrition, sleep, and elimination. That's pretty much the game plan from the get-go. And though we are alive, we have no identity yet. I mean, we do in terms of our parents, but we have no sense of self. We're completely vulnerable, completely and totally dependent on our caregivers for survival. And that's true of our species for many years to come. I mean, other species come out of the womb, kind of hit the ground running, not so for humankind. But during our developmental years, our early years, we begin to require what I'm going to call the mask, this outward identity. We wear it throughout our lives, and it's cumulative. We build it up over time. Initially our caregivers defined the mask for us because we're not yet able to do so. So they think of things like, oh, she was such a good baby, or he's a real dynamo, and other labels that we put on infants and small children, or he's a fussy baby, or he's a really, good sleeper. These are the beginnings of this identity that's being imposed upon us. And then later, as this process develops, our siblings, our peers, the environment, our faith tradition, our culture, our teachers, all add to the image, all add to this sense of self that we begin to acquire. We get messages about the parts of us that are good and acceptable, and we get messages from the culture and parents and everybody else about the parts of us that are so-called bad or shameful. And we unconsciously emphasize the good parts as we acquire this mask and try to hide the bad parts. We sort of say, no, I want the world to see me in the best light. I mean, that's just sort of hardwired into us. And this process is gradual. And it occurs over the course of our development through our pre-teen years. And then the process really takes off like a rocket during our teen years when we begin to define our sense of self, our mask, with this huge input from our peers. I mean, peers reign supreme during adolescence, as we all can painfully remember. So from early on, we begin to believe that this mask or this identity is fixed and permanent. We call it our self. But as we talked about last month, it's simply a narrative. It's just a bunch of made up stories we tell ourselves or others tell about us. Okay. What if we were raised in a completely different culture, different parents, different values, different child rearing methods, with completely different stories? Our mask would be very different. It would be, as different as someone from, a foreign country or another culture. This is how we know that the self, which we think of as so solid and so permanent, is impermanent, malleable, changeable. This is how, and this is something that Buddha understood brilliantly. He understood this thing is not fixed, it's evolving, it's changing, it's subject to all the influences outside of us as we grow up and develop. And the ego kicks in really early. We become identified with this mask we wear as if it was the true us. But this ego kicks in early to protect the mask, to gain admiration for the mask, to get acceptance, to give power to the mask, to get its needs met. And it works very hard to hide our flaws, our failings, our perceived defects, which is why we cling so tightly to it. But it is not really who we are. It is not our essence. If we cling to the masks, we are not seeing ourselves clearly. And clinging to it can be exhausting, and the failure to maintain it can cause us great suffering, embarrassment, shame, and the like. Okay. So that's the background. But the good news is that with this practice and the teachings of the Buddha, we can begin to take off the mask, at least in appropriate situations, and with ourselves, most importantly. We tame the ego. We do not let it control who we are in the world. We move past what we psychologists call the false self to our true self. The mask is the false self. Famous psychologist, British psychologist years ago, identified this as what he called the false self, the thing we carry around and present to the world. And this thing which when we take it off brings us freedom and ease. We don't have to work so hard to maintain some image. We're not all about image consciousness. We're not all about how the world sees us. Because of what we know about impermanence, we can set our masks aside and see that we are ever changing and composed of lots of facets, lots of moods, lots of attitudes, lots of different outlooks, which is in a constant flow. This is always in flux. Okay. We see that trying to cling to the mask and maintain that image is the root of so much of our suffering. If I think the world needs to see me a certain way and I deviate from it, then I'm hit with all this suffering about, oh my gosh, I've been exposed. I'm so ashamed. I'm so embarrassed. I shouldn't be seen. We see how we censor ourselves. We see how we put on airs, and, always trying to show the world our best selves. It is exhausting, and it requires a certain amount of emotional rigidity. We have to rigidly adhere to this script, this mask, this self, whatever we want to call it. And driven by the ego and the need to protect the mask, we act in ways that often cause harm, both to ourselves and others. We're not honest with ourselves. We're not honest with others about who we are and what we are. And we struggle. And in no way am I suggesting this process is easy. It requires tremendous commitment and tremendous courage. But it's one of the reasons we practice this path, to create authenticity, to present to the world who we really are, not as we want the world to think we are, which is wearing that mask. The rewards are huge. There's reduced suffering in our own lives and in those we love. There is joy and there is freedom in accepting all of who we are. We don't have to spend so much energy hiding parts of ourselves. This is one of the things, you've heard me say this before, that I love about the 12-step tradition, because this is a huge part of that process. They may not use the same language that I'm using today, but it's all about, dropping the mask, authenticity, and so forth. We are not, at the end of the day, the mask that others put on us growing up and that later we put on ourselves. We spend so much energy creating this persona. And again, I'm not suggesting that when we set down the mask or we try to move away from it, that we interact with the world without discernment, without wisdom, without a lack of an ethical base. I'm not saying we just open ourselves up. We just, here I am, world, take a shot at me. But what I am saying is that if we use discernment and choose where we show our true selves, of course we're going to go out and present to the world as we are. We can't overcome that. But I'm talking about having the capacity to go beyond that and relate in an honest, open way in terms of who we truly are, and the joy and the freedom that comes with that. I mean, that is fundamental to the Buddhist teachings. That we see that we're connected to everyone and everything beyond the small ego-driven sense of self. This is summed up to me, this perhaps best summed up with a quote from a song from the late Leonard Cohen, who was, as you know, a singer and a Zen priest. This quote is from his song Anthem. Some of you know this. It goes, quote, "Ring the bells that still can ring, forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Ring the bells that still can ring, forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. So let me stop there and get your